So thank you for this. This is, I realize that about 1/3 of my slides perfectly overlap with what Kamal was just talking about. But what I wanted to describe was the move towards understanding institutions as a mechanism of inequality. So this is partly going to be intellectual biography for me of the last 3 years, but I hope is going to cover some of the things that have been going on in the field. This is a roadmap. What do we mean by inequality? Is it bad? How does it vary? How does it change over time? How do institutions relate to inequality? And if you have to get up before the end, some of the answers are yes, lots, up, it's complicated. So that's where we want to end up. First one is, what do we mean by inequality? And so I was talking to Pam Taubert the other day about I'm thinking of what are you going to do on the panel? I'm going to talk about sort of gender inequality. And I thought, oh my God, gender inequality. I hadn't even thought about that as a topic. I always look at Gini coefficients. Then I realized that what we study, or what we claim to be interested in when we study inequality, is really variable. So what people say, I study inequality, they can be doing all kinds of different stuff. So it could be that they're studying poverty. Their real interest is, why are some people or groups poor? Why do some countries have higher poverty rates than others? So that might be sort of the topic of development economics or the study of poverty. So that's one possibility. They could be studying mobility. So how do some people get rich, or how do they maintain their wealth over time? This would be Johan Chu's dissertation topic. If you're hiring this year, talk to Johan during the break. He's doing really brilliant work about how the 1% always win. So that's a possible topic. Mobility. How do people move up or not? How do societies vary around that? It could be global inequality. I don't particularly like this phrase, but this is a term used in the book, How Countries Fail? Is that it? The Acemoglu and Robinson book. And what they mean by inequality is just GDP per capita around the world and how that varies among countries. And in fact, the classic question of economics is the wealth of nations. Why are some countries rich and other countries poor? And how does that change over time? So Doug North, that's his whole topic as well. He thinks this is a central topic in economics, is understanding why some countries are rich and others aren't. But that's using the country as the unit of analysis and looking at maybe their trajectories over time. How did Korea go from being really poor to really rich? And why has that not happened in other countries? Why not Haiti? And then comparative inequality, and this is where I'm going to end up, is why do some nations have greater internal inequality of income or wealth? And what accounts for national trends in income distributions? So that's the thing that I'm interested in at the expense of all of those other things. So why is it that the US has so much greater distributional inequality than Canada, which many people don't realize that there's a difference between them? That on the surface, if you're not paying attention, like Canada's sort of slightly more polite, more enthusiastic about hockey, but vastly less unequal than the US. So how did that happen? And that's the thing that I want to get at, is the institutional sort of aspects of that at the national level. So there's a matrix of possible topics that you could study, and I tried to write them all down. I wanted to make a 3-dimensional map, but then I got into 8 dimensions and it became a big old mess. So units of analysis, you could be looking at countries, inequality within or across countries, and that's a pretty good topic. Or it could be organizations. Why is there so much more inequality in some organizations than others? How does that change over time? The kind of measures you use. You could look at concentration. So why does the 1%, how does the 1% differ from everybody else? And so if you look at the Piketty and Says articles that have made a lot of headway in inequality, they're not looking at broad distribution, but just the 1% using income tax data. The advantages, you can go back to 1913. The disadvantages, it's just the 1%. It's sort of dissimilar. Anyway, there's advantages and disadvantages. And you could look at one point in time, the distributions or the trajectory. You could look at income, or you could look at wealth, which you get really different pictures. The wealth inequality is much more stark and horrifying than income inequality. Half the people in the US have negative net worths, something like that. I just made that up for the purpose of the video, but it's probably true. It's true-ish. So Picasso once famously said, art is a lie that makes you see the truth. And that's going to be the case with a couple of my facts here. You could look at the distribution of things. So the distribution of income, the distribution of wealth, rather than just the top 1%. Or you could look at divides, like race and sex. So Pam's question was men versus women. I was like, yeah, that's actually a great topic, and I haven't thought about it. If you add all of these up, you end up getting this Rubik's Cube of possibilities. And if I'd had the intellectual energy to go all the way through and make the 8-dimensional map, then whenever people start talking about a paper today, they could say, I'm in square 6G4, sector 3, which is distributions within organizations over time, looking at wealth or something like that. But that's complicated. So we say we study inequality, and it turns out to be this really vast, broad area. We can mean lots of things and not be talking to each other at all. So I don't know if this is an orienting device or what, but that's the way that I've been trying to think about how do you have a coherent conversation on this topic. So this is going to be the cartoon version of how sociologists have looked at this question. Cartoon version with a trajectory. It's going to be a Whiggish history of the study of inequality. I read Hari's paper this morning and realized, wow, he did a really thoughtful version of this and actually read the papers that I'm claiming to summarize. So if you want the truth about this, read Hari's paper, but I'm going to give you the cartoon version of how we've done this. So 60s and 70s, when Paul Morris Hirsch was in graduate school, people who studied inequality and sociology might have been looking at individual attainment, so income or socioeconomic status. This would be the Otis Leslie Duncan version of studying inequality. Typical study would take survey data, and people would answer, what's your income, what's your race, sex, how far did your mother get in school, what's your job? They'd run regressions. And they claim to study individual attainment, and then the variable, what's your mother's college, your mother's highest education, that would be intergenerational transfer. Paul, is this right? What's that? Yeah, so that was like an entire field of sociology looked at these individual level studies. Awesome enough as a place to start. The critique of this is that attainment happens within organizations, not in society. So people don't enter this giant foot race with everyone in society. They get hired or not in organizations, and they move up or not within organizations. So Barron and Vealby's sort of big advance in this literature was to say, it's not individuals that get ahead, it's individuals within organizations. If you want to make sense of individual attainment, look at what firms do. Look at their internal labor markets. Who do they hire? Is there occupational segregation? And that was kind of a big advance and made this a suitable topic for organization theory types. So the organizations literature from the 80s to the 2000s looked at what explains variation in hiring practices and career ladders within organizations. So then it's a feature of organizations that's being explained rather than individuals per se. Typical study here might compare internal labor markets or the prevalence of women and minorities in management across firms. Great stuff that's still going on today. The critique here is that it's a bit coarse-grained. So you can't just say big firms versus small firms or industry. You have to get pretty good data to get at that. And it's really freakishly hard to get information on career ladders within organizations. If you're really lucky and spend your entire career badgering people, you might get the California Civil Service and then look at job ladders within that. It's awesome to do that, but it's possible that the California Civil Service is not perfectly representative of capitalist work organizations across America. I don't know. I mean, I haven't looked at the other ones, but that seems plausible. So where we are now, as I see it, is and where we're going in the future, is how do institutional configurations shape income and mobility within and across organizations. So that's more of a mouthful than the other two, but I think that's about right. What are the relevant institutions that shape what an organization is and how it does what it does? So Flannery is not here. Is she coming?
No.
Really? Oh, so she's my student, so I think she's really brilliant. So I'm sorry you're going to miss this. You should totally read the paper, and if you edit a journal, you should publish it. She looks at how cities' politics, norms, business cultures, and elite networks influence occupational segregation or attainment. I describe her work as saying, why is the glass ceiling higher in Minneapolis than Phoenix? It turns out that it's not just organizations. If you look at the establishment level, the same GE outlet in Atlanta and San Diego and Biloxi are going to have really different job ladders. And so it's not just the organization, it's something about urban culture and the laws. Turns out that for those of you of the fair sex in the room, if you plan on working in the US, get a job in a federal court district with more women judges. Because then when you sue your employer for screwing you over, you're much more likely to win. Employers know this and they respond by having much better representation of women at the top. Who would have guessed? Her mother's a federal judge, so. But it's very interesting that the court system that you're in, the relevant federal district, shapes whether you get ahead or not. That firms respond to that. So that's a really different thing than just looking at the California Civil Service. That's looking at, the way I describe this is, there's similar fish all up and down the Mississippi, but the ones that you catch in Minnesota are going to taste really different from the ones that you catch in New Orleans, where it's all toxic waste. So they're the same fish, but they're in an environment that makes their flavor a bit more piquant or toxic. And what I've been working on with Adam Cobb somewhat is how do national institutions shape what a corporation is and how it affects income inequality. So here the question is really, what do we mean by corporation? We use that word corporation as if it were a bass or a trout. But it's not that same thing. The same word describes a lot of different stuff across cultures, and that's the thing that we need to better understand. We're going to get a bit more to that toward the end. So quickly, the people that study national inequality typically use the Gini coefficient. So when I say inequality, what I'm going to mean is income inequality at the economy-wide level, so US, Canada, and so on. So stipulate from here on out, that's what I mean, not that stuff about men and women. Sorry. So this is the famous Gini coefficient. The Lorenz curve is if you line everybody up from lowest income to highest income and then ask what percentage do they get, you get these different lines. So that's the Lorenz curve. The Gini index is what proportion of this lower half is gray. So if Bill Gates has all of the income, this is pretty much warm. The entire area is gray. If it's, a Denmark, Christiania kind of hippie commune and everybody's equal, then it's 0 because nothing's under there. So 0 to 1, 0 highly equal, 1 highly unequal. So 1 is bad if you think inequality is bad. And I'm a neutral social scientist. I don't go making value judgment calls about whether inequality is a good thing or a bad thing. It's just a thing. Well, is inequality bad? What do we mean by bad, really? So I'm going to show you a bunch of slides that are reruns quickly. So you're going to notice that the U.S. is pretty much always up here in the upper right quadrant. So health and social problems, mental illness, drug use, life expectancy, infant mortality rates, homicide rates. The U.S. is really this interesting outlier there. Rates of imprisonment. So anything that some people might call bad. I mean, infant mortality, who am I to judge whether higher is worse or better? I'm just a neutral social scientist. I don't want to impose my values on any other culture. But if you think infant mortality is bad, then it's a bad thing that more unequal is associated with a lot more of it. And if you're a defender of inequality, if you're sort of an Ayn Rand kind of business school professor, as most of us are, presumably, say, yeah, bad, but that is the price that you pay. If you want to attract entrepreneurs to America, you need to have super high income inequality so that people have helipads on the top of their skyscrapers and the Google guys own their own 787 so they can have gravity-free. And that kind of inequality is awesome because it promotes entrepreneurship and economic growth. So if we want a healthy economy, lots of inequality is great because more people will start their own shoe shine stands that will then turn into Google and then they'll be rich too. It turns out that's actually false. So if you look at the rate of GDP per capita as a measure of sort of success in an economy, and inequality, it generally goes down. The richer you get, the more equal, unless you're the US or a Chinese city-state. So if Vancouver secedes, I assume it's going to be America. Just kidding, it's not really a Chinese. Although, okay. I was walking from the train back last night past the hostel. Steve, as a Grateful Dead fan, you're going to appreciate this. There was so much weed fume coming out of that place. It was so it's close if you're looking. So how has it changed over time in the US? So we study inequality cross-sectionally. We say the US is really unequal, other places less so, and we often do these static comparisons, and I'm going to perpetuate that a little bit. But the same thing that Kamal said, that inequality in the US got to be about where it was on the verge of the Great Depression. So there's some reason to believe that inequality is followed by bad things. Who knows? It happened once, maybe twice, you can say. Income gain since 1979, same story, the 1% are getting all the goodies. And you might say, if you were an economist, yeah, but that's not because of any sinister conspiracy or anything like that, or everybody reading Ayn Rand and moving to Colorado, if only they would. It's actually because skill-based technological change, that because of changes in the nature of the economy, you used to be able to get a job in manufacturing with low skill and make a reasonable wage. Now the internet has changed everything, so don't blame politics, blame the internet, because some people know how to get onto Facebook and others don't, and those that can get onto Facebook get much higher paying jobs and start their own app company. So that's a plausible, if you needed a rationale, that's a pretty good one. It's no conspiracy, it's just that some people have those rare, valuable skills like Mark Zuckerberg and others don't. So the problem is that doesn't actually seem to be true in the sense of factually accurate on the Picasso sense. So let's compare 3 randomly selected English-speaking countries that are on the Atlantic. There doesn't seem to be this general trend everywhere in the world, and I'll show more data about this later. So let's test this sort of hypothesis about the internet. This is the year that Margaret Thatcher was elected, as portrayed by Meryl Streep. This is when the World Wide Web was introduced. Now, I'm no historian, and so time series data frighten and confuse me, but if you had to pick a moment that was a turning point, that might be the one on which I would focus. So the cryptic thing for the Canadians in the room is what happened in 1975, because Canada is just like as stable as a rock. So what causes inequality? And if you are a Democrat in the United States, your answer to everything is it's the decline of unions. And that is an awesome story. If you're in the industrial and labor relations school, you actually have to swear an oath that every social problem is attributable to the decline of unions in the United States. I assume you've got the tattoo with exactly this figure showing how all bad things, climate change is attributable. And that is actually a great story, but a complicated story if you actually compare the data. So this is a gross way to do things, but union density has declined in the US pretty much every year since 1958. As of January 2010, interestingly, most union members are public employees, so it's only about 7% of the private labor force. That is certainly, if you believe in good and bad, that's a bad thing, I think. But as far as being the primary cause, this is one of those cases where where the ecologists are right about taking really long time series. Because if you studied your data in 1980 and said our punctuation point is the election of Ronald Reagan, you'd find a nearly perfect negative correlation. The more unions declined, the more inequality went up. But if you were a sociologist and said I'm studying the 50s to the 70s, you'd say, wow. The more unions declined, the more inequality went down. Therefore, unions actually cause inequality, and as they've gone away. So if you take the whole time series, you end up finding it's probably not that per se. This could be complicated, and we can talk about complicating it later. I got a different and weirder explanation, which is in my awesome yet never read or cited paper with Adam Cobb on this topic. So my thought after writing that wonderful book, oh, Pam's got a copy, managed by the markets. Maybe you'll hold that up. Oh, that is... So I spent a bunch of years documenting the way that American corporations have been collapsing and turned into these supply chains stretching back to Bangladesh or Congo, and sort of what's the link of that to finance. And one of my hunches was maybe this has something to do with the whole inequality thing. Maybe the shape of corporate, maybe Barron and Bealby are right. And if you change the demography and the shapes of organizations, then you get different levels of inequality. So if GM, instead of being one giant company with 800,000 people, as it used to be, were 20 companies with the finance department being a hedge fund and the grounds crew being undocumented immigrants, maybe you'd see more inequality in society because things have been divided up. We came up with this super gross, crude measure that I want to patent or trademark, which is employment concentration. It was shocking to me that evidently we actually invented this thing. You'd think this is kind of too obvious, but I looked it up and we evidently invented this idea. So concentration meaning the number of workers employed by the N largest domestic firms in an economy divided by the total labor force. There's another version of employment concentration, which is what proportion of people in a city or area are employed in an industry. So employment concentration means how many people in Detroit work in cars, or how many people in Ithaca work in selling weed, or whatever your major industry is there. The surprising finding about this is that there's this very, very high correlation between employment concentration using the 10 biggest domestic employers and the top 25, 50, or 100 biggest firms. They're correlated above 0.9. So what that means for data purposes is, if you get the top 10, that's a pretty good thin slice. That'll give you a pretty good indication of what goes on all the way down. They're not qualitatively different from everybody else. So it suggests that the corporate tendency toward gigantism is evident even with a thin slice of data. Even the top 10 will give you some purchase on the shape of the economy. And so this is one of the greatest moments of my life was seeing this diagram. This is the link between income inequality in the US and employment concentration in the US. And the correlation over time is negative 0.89. That's in absolute value, that's a really big correlation. That's like the correlation between height and weight. So that's freaky. That's for such a gross measure to have that level of correlation is really odd. And it's not just because one's always going up and one's going down. This is like, since we're in Canada, this is like Paris figure skating, where there's some both doing the same pattern, but they're in mirror image. It's like, well, that's odd. How did that can't actually be true, can it? To give you a flavor for the background, so this is employment in General Motors. The US is at this point where big employers are a thing of the past, other than Walmart, which has 1.4 million US employees, but 60% annual turnover. So the notion of big employers where people stick around a long time is mostly gone in the US. My local example is General Motors. I spent the day looking up Moody's reports going back to 1920 to document this. And that's what it looks like. It's basically collapsed since the mid-1980s. So GM's employment today is almost exactly what it was in 1928, right before the Great Depression. So this is a small version or an indicator for broad trends in society. In the paper with Adam, this is a great thing. If you have Stata, and I know you do, this is a really nice way to tell a story over time. This is like those connected dot diagrams that kids do, but showing time series data, the link between employment concentration. So these are relatively big firms, and these are relatively smaller firms, and inequality. And so starting in 1950, you see that over the course of the 1960s, as companies got really big, as ITT bought up copper mines in Chile, and their for-profit colleges, and the people that made Twinkies and Hartford Insurance, When they got really big and controlled everything, they sent their HR minions out to all of the companies they acquired and said, here's your new personnel handbook, here's how you're gonna pay people. And it basically flattened out wages, relatively speaking. So when lots of people were employed in a few big firms, you saw relative equality. Over the course of the 80s, the bust-up takeovers happened. Of course, of the 90s, because of the love of shareholder value, companies were downsizing and outsourcing. And so what we're looking for here is this general shape. The bigger the firm, the lower the inequality, which I think is quite counterintuitive. So we call it the paradox of hierarchy, because you think big firms, it's CEOs that are being overpaid that are responsible for all the bad inequality in the world. That's not really it. I mean, CEOs are overpaid when they make $10 million, but last year, 4 hedge fund managers made more than $1 billion. Number one was David Tepper. So if anybody's here from Carnegie Mellon, your benefactor was the highest paid hedge fund manager, $2.2 billion last year. It's inconceivable that any CEO would make that much money. There's just limits. I mean, it's high, but it's 100 times smaller than what hedge fund managers are making. That's where the crazy stratospheric levels of inequality are, is in the finance sector, not in the public corporation. So what does it look like around the rest of the world? Turns out that this is generally the case. Big employers are associated with low inequality. So if you want miserable inequality, Latin America is your place to go. Colombia, not British Columbia, but the other one, has the highest inequality in 2006. And it's like a bunch of Latin American countries are the land of inequality. Asia Alley, so I'm actually going to make a claim here that Asia does not actually exist. At least the notion that there's anything coherent about Asian economies or Asian culture. I mean, you say it about Europe and you go, yeah, that actually makes sense. Spain, Germany, France are basically the same thing. I'm here to tell you that Thailand, Korea, China, and Philippines are not at all the same. Calling them Asia is actually just makes no sense at all. They are so divergent among each other that it makes, so I think only Westerners think it makes sense to talk about an Asian model as if that made sense. Okay, and end of my soapbox. Old Europe, as Dick Cheney used to call it. This is the part that actually throws everything off for my model. If I throw out the commie corner, Czech Republic, Hungary, Belarus, Romania, Slovakia, Serbia, if I could throw them out, the model works perfectly. The problem is they have very low inequality, but all of their state-owned firms got sold to Hyundai and Siemens and Volkswagen, and so they don't really have giant domestic employers. They're all owned by foreigners, so it sort of screws up the model. So I'm going to throw them out as an outlier. And then the Nordic niche. The outlier here is Iceland, because this is 2006. At that moment, everyone in the country worked at those 3 banks that subsequently disappeared. So Iceland's now down here somewhere, but at that moment, everybody worked at these banks. And then there's North America, so that's Canada. And that's the US. Our closest neighbor is the Russian Federation, interestingly enough. To give a feel for what this looks like, and so I think that in itself is an institutionally interesting fact, that there is huge variation in countries' abilities to grow big employers. So you look around the world, the ability to grow a really, really big company is not very widely distributed, and it's more distributed in certain kinds of countries than others. So I highly recommend you read Hari's paper. One explanation of that could be low inequality leads to higher levels of trust that enable you to have very big organizations. That's the opposite causality from the story that I'm spinning, but it's a very attractive one, and you've got actual facts behind it yourself. So to give a feel for what that looks like at the opposite ends of the spectrum, this is 2006, the 10 biggest domestic corporations in Colombia. And number one was Bancolombia with 7,000 employees. To add up the top 10, you get 40,000 people. Colombia has about 45 million people in it, and so the employment concentration for them was 0.18%. Biggest employer is tiny, is like a couple of restaurants in downtown Vancouver. Denmark, 5.5 million people. Their biggest domestic employer had 273,000. Actually, these two have now merged. So their biggest domestic employer is 550,000 people, not all in Denmark, but largely, on a population base of 5.5 million. And so, I'm going to get rid of that synchronization. So down here you would see that Denmark's employment concentration is 25%. So firms are 100 times bigger in relative terms in Denmark, the most equal country, than in Colombia, the most unequal country. So those are extremes, but that is intriguing, I think. That inequality seems to be really intrinsically linked somehow to the nature of domestic corporate employers. And now the part where institutions become more explicitly relevant. So I have a gnomic research question. I'm going to try to popularize the term gnomic because it's cryptic and mysterious. Corporations like breakfast. Pam, you got a free book. Our corporations like breakfast. All right, we will back into it then. Johan knows the answer. What do you eat for breakfast in Korea? Well, not you. What is a traditional breakfast?
Table of rice, lots of different types of small dishes, maybe a soup.
Okay, and what do you eat in Ithaca?
Bacon and eggs.
Bacon and eggs?
Well, okay, so some people eat granola and yogurt.
Thank you. Not vegans, but yeah. All right, bacon and eggs. Traditional breakfast in France? Croissant, okay. Yeah. There's a lot of we call that meal breakfast all around the world. It's like the first thing you eat in the morning is breakfast. But if you actually look at what people eat, it is utterly idiosyncratic and different. So how is a corporation like? It's gnomic but awesome, I think. That we use a language as if you'd expect to see the same thing. You go down for breakfast at the hotel. Oh my God, it's bacon and eggs. Who are these fleshmongers eating this much cholesterol in the morning? What is wrong with them? They should be having soup with some side dishes and kimchi. So the institutions part here is, I think, one of the great overlooked books of the last 10 years was Bruno Amable's book about varieties of capitalism. So there's another flavor of varieties of capitalism with these Harvard guys. And they have two, basically. There's like the German flavor, which is sort of socially regulated markets, and the American or Anglo flavor, which is markets über alles, as they'd say in Germany. And then there's a bunch of things in the middle. So it's basically a continuum of types from social to full-on markets. As a social science rule, never have a continuum because it's never true. Or you could set it up and then other people write dissertations showing how actually there's 5 dimensions and you've totally oversimplified and gotten it wrong. So you can be the straw man for other people's subsequent research. So Amable's version, which I like very much, and I think you should all read his book or read my summary of it, but then cite him. He sort of went on a full-on data format, which is to take a bunch of national level factors of national institutions. So how do they regulate product market competition? Do they have anti-monopoly things like in the US or let it rip like in Germany? How do they regulate the labor market? How do they organize social welfare provision? How do they organize the educational system? And how do they organize capital markets? Is it primarily banks or market-based? So 5 broad layers of institutions. Can't go into the details, but he threw them into the blender, did a bunch of content analysis, and said, I'll be damned. There are these syndromes of types of ways that people deal with each of these 5 institutions. And if you put them all together, it turns out there's configurations that seem to make more or less sense. So in Germany, if you spend your life or your young life training to work at a machine tool company, learning highly specialized firm-specific skills, that makes sense because it's been in that same family for 150 years, funded by the same local bank. They're never going to sell it, and you're going to have a career there for life. In the US, you'd be a total idiot to train to work at a machine tool company because 3 weeks after you started, after paying for that private college training to get there, they'd be taken over and the jobs would be shipped to China, and then you'd go on welfare, which is so terrible in the US that you'd actually end up starving in the street. So sensible courses of action and what firms look like in Germany, you can be a machine tool company because you'll get labor because the social contract is going to, of course, have the whole mess fits together. In the US, Go for generalist, don't learn anything specific. So the flavor of firm that you get depends on these institutional configurations. The kinds of firms you're going to get in Denmark is really different from the kinds you're going to get in Canada, let's say. So he ends up describing 5 flavors of capitalism, and it's always very European and North American focused. So sorry for anyone from East Asia. You've got the market-based model, the Scandinavian model, the continental model, the Mediterranean model, and then what he calls the Asian model, which I'm going to say you should not lump Japan and South Korea together momentarily. But large corporations coordinate with the state. So you see these syndromes of flavors of capitalism across types. And it turns out, and the reason why I was so excited about this book, is that it maps surprisingly well onto those 2 things that I was looking at, inequality and corporate size. But they really clustered into neighborhoods surprisingly well, except for the US, which is a bizarre outlier that throws every damn model off. Australia, UK, and also right about there. So that was intriguing to me, was that those institutional configurations seem to be linked to both corporate size and inequality. So maybe there was some third factor driving both of these things together. And this is where my mind starts to fall apart, because I don't have the youthful energy that you young people do in thinking about that many dimensions of, I'm no Obama. So how do those trajectories change over time? This starts to complicate things because that works fine if you're doing a cross-section, as we were with 2006. So we got 1 year, we can finally start to nail this down. It turns out they don't stay still. They all change over time. And so what you get when you do the comparisons, it matters a lot what slice you're looking at. So Japan is that one, and Korea is that one. Complete divergence. Which year you pick would determine whether you classify them as the same or not. Social democratic bounces around again. Mediterranean is just kind of schizo. So this is Italy and Portugal, I think, in that one. And then continental Europe. So this is sort of so France, I think, actually is an advanced economy with technology and the internet, and they belie every story about how it's skill-based competition. Basically, inequality has dropped almost continuously since 1960 in France. So there's nothing inevitable about going towards high inequality. What I like about this the best, and this is eerie, is the Millennial Convergence. If you looked at all of these, so if you're going to do a dissertation on this topic, I suggest you use 1999 as your year, because weirdly, in every sector, 1999, all of the paths crossed. Is that not weird? I honestly have no they didn't cross at the same spot, but within families, they were all in the same place in 1999. Prince predicted. Prince predicted. So that suggests that, so that is a weird thing, is that they're dancing to different drummers, but something about that 1 year they all got together. I don't want to attach too much mystery to it, but it is a little bit freakish. But then you get the English-speaking models, and you discover that the notion of an Anglo-Saxon model is ridiculous. The US and Canada are not identical twins. They have really, really different models. So people outside North America might imagine that they're the same thing. They're really, really different, really, really different beasts. The organization of capital markets, family ownership. Canada has 6 banks or so. They've had 2 bank failures since 1930. Since 1930, the U.S. has 2 bank failures every Friday, because that's when the FDIC moves in, with their black SUVs to take things over. So it suggests that model per se might be implying a coherence. I mean, Germany and U.S. or whatever that sort of the two flavors, market, competitive market. What are those things called? Do you know? The Holland-Susskiss thing?
Liberal market, non-subordinate.
Yeah, thank you. If you get to be my age, you can't keep all that stuff in your head, so that's where my password for my phone is now stored, is what did you call those two? So the notion of 2 is clearly wrong, but the notion of 5 probably seems wrong. And this is only Europe, North America, and 2 Asian countries. So you can imagine if you actually took Africa as a continent seriously, South America as a continent seriously, we might end up with 50 different models. And that isn't actually a model at all. That's just a whole lot of case. That's like a Harvard way to think about things. Everything's unique. So then I started, so the way I started thinking about this, I'm going to quit soon, I promise. The way I started thinking about this was that we had this great relation in the US, this wonderful causal relation. It was actually true. Size and inequality mattered a bunch in the US. Does it matter anywhere else in the world in the same way? And so we're doing that same sort of tracking with different flavors of capitalism. So this is the UK, US, and Canada. UK and US actually works pretty well. The overtime change between employer size and inequality seems to work out. Canada a little bit dicier. But then you get to Korea and Japan, and nothing makes sense. The correlations, look at this, like a huge positive correlation. I can't explain what this looks like. Scandinavia, 6, 8, 6, 9. Wow, that is total. This is like Finland is the total opposite of what we were finding in the US. What the hell is going on here? As the Mediterranean countries, I don't know what's going on in Portugal. Companies are getting bigger, I guess, relatively speaking. All right, Spain is the only one that's going to fit with our story, but that does not actually look very good for us. And continental Europe, all over the map. So this is a little bit traumatizing. We had perfectly explained everything in the US. We had nailed down, we had a perfect understanding of the transhistorical link between corporate structure and inequality. And if we had just quit there, everything would have been fine. But because of you meddling kids, because of our desire to actually understand whether it played out, now we're at a bit more of a psychedelic state. So this is not going to work well for me because I hate all team sports. But it seems to me that what's actually going on is kind of like the US is playing American football. So in American football, there's a very high correlation between how many yards you run and the score. And a higher score is good in American football. So if you can explain yards run, you're going to get a pretty good job of explaining what the score is. In soccer, or what Europeans call football, or English people call footy, there is no correlation. You run all the time up and down the field, but they only score like once in the entire damn game, and so counting yards doesn't really help you a lot. Something else is causing that. So what we need to think about is, how does this mesh of institutions shape corporate size and its link to inequality? So Hari has an interesting story in his paper, which is ambient levels of social trust are what you need to build organizations. High inequality erodes trust, and that makes it hard to build big organizations. So that's a pretty good story for some countries. But how does that fit with the other structure of education, social welfare institutions? We can't just look at firms, we need to look at national level institutions to get a better flavor for this. So here's where we are in terms of facts and where to go next. So corporate size varies widely and systematically around the world, both in absolute terms and relative to the size of the labor force. Some countries get giant companies, some do not. In fact, the biggest private employer in Colombia turns out to be Dole Fruit, which is an American firm. It's much bigger than any domestic companies, intriguingly enough. Corporate employment concentration seems to be positively related to inequality, at least in the cross-section, if not over time. The size of the country's largest corporations and its level of inequality seem to be somehow intrinsically linked to its variety of capitalism. So we got a kind of fuzzy causal chain that we're trying to work on here, and here's where we've gotten so far, is that the variety of capitalism leads to the concept of the corporation. So what is breakfast in your country? What kind of stuff in Europe, people drink liquor at breakfast. In the US, you'd be institutionalized if you tried to have a shot of liquor. So varies a lot by the variety of capitalism. What counts as breakfast, what counts as a corporation is shaped by the sort of institutional rules of the game. That in turn leads to corporate size, which is somehow linked to inequality. And if you're interested in doing this stuff, so we're doing something, where's Drawer? No, Drawer. So in Drawer's paper, if you read that, they're putting up this wiki about Marcellus shale drilling, which is really cool. So the data will be available online. You can add data, you can take away data, use it for your own purposes. We're trying to do much the same thing that you're up to with the inequality data. So if you go to worldinequality.org, you can log in and download. We've linked to every source of data in the world about inequality. So if you're running a statistics class and you need some good data, send your students here. We're also posting all of our corporate size data. So every country that we can get, we're just throwing it up there saying, here are the biggest companies, here's how many employees, go to town. Because we realize we could never, I don't speak Slovenian, and so I can't actually put together the data. So we're hoping this will be a central place where people and throw their own data up, take our stuff, show that we're wrong, show that we're right, I don't know, but that it'll allow people to gather and contribute to the data in an open source way so that we can better think about this big question, which is clearly, I think, too big for one kind of, one research team. So that's where we're at. All right, now you can tell me what I got wrong.